Welcome back. I hope you all had a good fall break. Today we'll be talking about the brain and the communication systems in the body. So the week quiz 6 grade distribution is back. The average is a tad lower, and I would encourage you to particularly check your feedback for item 21 because it was a fill in the blanks question. And if you didn't use the exact word spelled the exact way, if you used a synonym or something was misspelled, then it'd be auto graded as wrong. So you want to make sure that if that happened, you can ask for the points back. I'll remind you that if you need an extension, please get that into the teaching assistant with 24 hours notice using the format that she asked for in the syllabus. And if you miss a deadline, then there's an extenuating circumstances form to fill in, and that is in the syllabus as well. So today in lecture, we'll talk about the communication systems in the body. So nervous, endocrine, enteric nervous. We'll talk about the brain, how we study it, and its structure and function. So what is a brain? Does anybody know what a brain is? You've never heard of a brain before. Do you have a brain? Yeah. So you don't know what a brain is, but you know that you have one. Yes?
Would it be like the command center where your body is?
That's one way we can think about it. Does a dog have a brain? Yes, I see heads nodding yes. Does a rat have a brain? Yeah, let's keep going with that. Does a worm have a brain? I see eyebrows. Hands up for yes, a worm has a brain. Nobody thinks. Do you think a worm has a brain? Worm does in fact have a brain. But an ant. Ants seem pretty smart. And they do some amazing things. They have some very adaptive behavior. Do ants have brains? Very simple. And in fact, if we can think about, well, a biologist would think about how ants might communicate with each other into a bigger kind of a hive mind. So we can keep going down from worm to ant to fruit fly. And at a certain point, we might say, no, that's really not a brain anymore. And that point is the mollusk. It's animals like oysters. They don't have a central nervous system. They have clusters of nerves, right? A bunch of neurons twined together becomes a nerve. So they have clusters of neurons or some nerves. We're going to call that a ganglia in important parts of the body. You know, and there might be, let's say, 3. The scientific attitude of humility, which was one of those 3 attitudes we read about in the first week, is a really good place to start from when we're studying the brain. So if what we need to know about the brain was a mile, then we know about 3 inches of that. There's a lot about the brain that we don't know. There's about 84 billion neurons, those are brain cells. And that's the number of stars in the Milky Way, which is our galaxy. And each one of those neurons has an average of about 7,000 synaptic direct connections to other neurons. That makes for trillions of connections, and we're not even thinking about the bigger pathways that we imply when we use terms like memory trace, which is a thing that we've never seen. That's a lot of complexity. That's a tremendous, mind-boggling amount of complexity. And we can't mimic more than a second of how this thing might work with a supercomputer. So to learn about brains and how they work, it's much easier to study simpler brains. The brain of the fruit fly, and yes, as you indicated, flies do have brains, and so do worms, but very simple ones with much fewer neurons. Well, the brain of the fruit fly has been imaged and completely mapped out. So all those neurons and connections and pathways and structures are known. And so scientists could decisively connect specific fruit fly behaviors to the structure and the function of its brain. If you look at animals that have simpler brains, so human down to dog, down to rat, the complexity of the animal's behavior gets simpler. Humans have tremendously complex behaviors, much more complex than a dog. And you can train a dog to do things that you couldn't train a rat to do. And there's a myth that you can train fleas, but it's not really true. Get the idea? Sort of the more complex the animal in terms of its behavior, the more complex the brain. When you're reading about the brain in an introductory psychology textbook, even one in, say, biological psychology, you might be assuming that all the claims you're reading about are based on research on human brains. Be forgiven for that, right? That's what you've been thinking. But if you look at those in-text citations, so if there's a claim or a statement, there should be a little citation, some names and a date for where that comes from. Well, start following those. See where they go. Track them down to through the references section at the back of the book down to the primary source, the scientific journal article. You'll find that many of them actually refer to research on rat brains. And we make an assumption that the findings will generalize to humans, and that's not an unreasonable one. But you can also recognize that the rat brain isn't going to completely reflect the human experience. So the nervous system is the body's speedy electrochemical communication network. It consists of all the nerve cells of the central and peripheral nervous systems. And the central nervous system refers to the brain and the spinal cord. It's the processing center of the body. I like what you were saying. And then the peripheral nervous system connects that central nervous system to the rest of your body, right down to the tips of your fingers and the ends of your toes. Not all cells in the nervous system are neurons. There are other cells as well, like there's glial cells that support and protect and feed the neurons. There's also different kinds of neurotransmitter. What is a neurotransmitter? Yes. So a neuron has to send a signal somehow. So you're talking about some big electrical signal, maybe one that starts in the brain perhaps, and then ends in your body moving. But let's go right down to the level of an individual neuron or cell. How does it tell the next cell in that chain that something's going on? How does it send it a message? Yes. They do send signals. And the neurotransmitter is not the first part of that process. What would be the first part? Maybe not the very first part. Remember, I used the word electrochemical. So there's maybe an electrical side to this and a chemical side to this. There is, and that's the neurotransmitter, but it's not the first thing that happens. So there's something called an action potential, which you will read about in your textbooks. And it can be kind of hard to wrap your mind with. And so I have put some recommended resources in Brightspace, like 2-minute neuroscience videos that explain it. But there's an electrical signal that goes through the neuron, and to the end of it, it's got these long arms. And then are those arms touching each other? Or is there a space between them? There is a space. Exactly. And what does the neurotransmitter do? They're like the little boats that get sent across the space, and they connect to receptors in the receiving neuron. So they are part of that signaling process, which is an electrochemical process. And there are different kinds of neurotransmitters. There's different kinds of boats, and maybe they're involved with different kinds of messages. So different neurotransmitters are associated with different functions, and this table is right out of your textbook. So we know, for instance, that the neurotransmitter serotonin is associated with mood. So if you have, or you know someone with depression, might have been prescribed a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. And what that drug would do is help keep those serotonin boats in the synapse, stop them from getting reabsorbed. So there's more of them out there. And so we know that there's some kind of a link between serotonin levels and depression, that they're lower in people who are depressed, but they're not part of the whole story. And there's many people who would have depression, go on an SSRI and not have a benefit from it, right? It's much bigger than that, or just that. We know that acetylcholine is associated with learning and memory. And there's a disease that damages the acetylcholine producing neurons. Anyone know what that is? Results in profound impairment to memory. Destroy your memory, ultimately, yes.
Alzheimer's?
Exactly. So that's a strong example of the importance of the neurotransmitter. We know that dopamine is associated with feeling rewarded, like with motivation, and drugs like cocaine that people are incredibly motivated to get and that can really become almost the center of somebody's life affect that dopaminergic system. Endorphins, which are released after exercise, make us feel good. Okay, so those they're different boats and they're involved in carrying different messages. We can't talk about brains without talking about zombies. So let's take a moment to discuss the neuropsychology of zombies. What's up with zombies? What makes them do that? Okay, so like a virus or an organism takes over the brain. And then what does it make the zombie do? Okay, and I saw a hand up there.
Oh, no, I was going to say
Same
something.
thing. This seems to be in the virus's interest. It's how it spreads itself around. Now that's called parasitism, where the human here is being just totally used as a host to spread around this zombie virus. It's a bit out of control, and if zombies took over the world, well then that's kind of it for the virus, because I assume they just die. It gets complicated because they're undead, and so maybe the metaphor starts to fail. But could something like this really happen? Could some microorganism affect your brain, your behavior? Sorry? Hypothetically, yes. Well, we've talked about the complexity of brains, and humans have the pinnacle, to be top, most complex and probably hard to take over brain. But as you pointed out, there are much simpler brains, okay, that can be subject to take over.
Our parasitized caterpillar has spent the last 12 days gorging itself. It now appears profoundly obese. But this is not all fat. The glomerata wasp larvae lie just under its skin. Each is the size of a grain of rice, but together they account for over a third of the caterpillar's weight.
parasitic wasp.
The larvae have not yet finished growing and need to keep their host alive. So although they feast on the caterpillar's blood, they have been careful not to touch a single one of its vital organs. This uneasy truce will not last. Within days, the larvae are fully matured. Suddenly, they begin to stir into action. For the past 2 weeks, this surrogate womb has protected them, but now they no longer need it. To complete the next stage of their life cycle, they must break out. The caterpillar's thick skin should be a solid barrier to the parasitic wasp larvae. But as their bodies have grown, they have developed tiny saw-like teeth. These jagged jaws are for one job only: cutting their way out.
Of the wasp larvae inside the caterpillar.
Stroke by stroke, the larvae slice through the tough layers of skin. At the same time, they release chemicals that paralyze the caterpillar. As the larvae break through, there is nothing it can do. Free at last, the larvae enter a new phase of development. They swiftly spin silken cocoons. These will provide the perfect environment for their final transformation. But ironically, one of the greatest dangers the larvae will face is being themselves impregnated by other species of parasitic wasp. Incredibly, the wounded caterpillar helps them out.
Taking over its brains.
Usually, a caterpillar would spin a silken blanket to make its own cocoon. But the parasitized caterpillar spins his blanket on top of the wasp cocoons, giving them an extra layer of protection. Scientists believe the same wasp virus that infected it weeks before has now invaded the caterpillar's brain and caused this bizarre corruption of its normal behavior. Amazingly, the caterpillar's natural aggression is now also exploited by the wasp virus. The caterpillar becomes a bodyguard, actively protecting the cocoons from other parasites. It will watch over them unceasingly until it eventually starves to death.
So that's not such a great deal for the caterpillar, right? It's taken over and it spends its entire life just supporting the parasitic wasp larvae. And ants can also be subject to that kind of zombification. So there's a fungus called cordyceps, and it infects ants that come across it, and it changes its behavior to benefit the fungus. So the infected ant will, instead of going where it would normally go to forage, it'll seek out the perfect spot for the fungus in terms of light and humidity. So they like kind of dark places and wet places. Fungus does anyway, right? And then once it finds that place, it goes, sorry, I'm losing my voice. The ant goes to the underside of a leaf where it bites in with its death bite. And what happens next is that the fungus in its body starts to grow, and erupting from this head is this sort of fruiting body. And then that sort of bursts and rains the fungal spores down on the ground so that it can infect other ants. Same kind of thing with this caterpillar. It's affected by baculovirus. So a caterpillar will come across that. Maybe it eats some leaf that has baculovirus on it. And then that causes the caterpillar host to feed without rest, right? And it changes the way that it responds to light that climbs up, right? Until it finds some high up twig or branch, or it dies over there. And then as its body decays, it kind of rains down this virus, right, in order to spread it around. So those are all examples of parasitism. So it's a situation that's not good for the host. Cordyceps can wipe out entire colonies of ants. Cordyceps and that nasty wasp are parasites, and parasites just destroy the host for their own benefit. And it's a strategy, but it might not be the best long-term game. So back to zombies, might not be totally adaptive on the part of the zombie virus. But do you think that microorganisms could control human behavior in their own interest without going quite that far? We have a symbiotic relationship even, where we do something for them and they do something for us. Yes?
Would the microorganisms have to have like brain systems?
It might do something like release neurotransmitters. So this does actually happen with us and has been going on for millions of years. You've probably heard about the enteric nervous system or the gut-brain axis.
The average human being hosts tens of trillions of microbes in and on our bodies, most of which reside in our intestines. And depending on the person, 2 to 6 pounds of our entire weight could be purely microbial. That's a lot of roommates who aren't paying rent, if you ask me. But it turns out that these microbial passengers are both giving back to us and potentially sabotaging us. Scientists are calling this the gut-brain axis, and some have even named it your second brain. It turns out that the teeming and diverse community in our gut acts as a collective unit with a mind of its own. That's right, we're talking microbial mind control. For example, your bacteria may be making your food choices for you. Some bacteria love eating fiber, some love pure sugar or fat, and depending on your diet, you may be cultivating a gut population with a preference for one over the other. Whichever your second brain prefers, it's probably going to tell you what it wants, loudly. And then complain when you don't feed it. Cue that hangry feeling when you just really need a chocolate bar at 3 p.m. Your microbes do this to you by hijacking your neurotransmitters until you feed them what they want. And when you do, there's a wave of relief as those bacteria release their happy feelings into your system, making you feel happy too. This interaction between your cravings and your microbiome and how your brain registers all of this is really complex. So if you want to learn more, just let us know and we'll look into it. When your bacteria feel happy, you feel happy because bacteria, as it turns out, communicate with one another via neurotransmitter. The same kind of chemicals used in your regular brain, like serotonin, dopamine, cortisol, and GABA. These chemicals transmit messages from one neuron to another in your brain, and because you host so many bacteria, when they use them, it can affect you and your mood too. The thing is, we're still unclear on how exactly these signals get from your gut to your brain. A likely candidate seems to be the vagus nerve, a really long nerve that connects your stomach and your intestines to the base of your brain, but it could also be your immune system or your endocrine system, or maybe it's all of them. But the results coming in from this kind of research are pretty remarkable. One research group at University College Cork in Ireland fed Lactobacillus rhamnosus, a good bacteria or a probiotic you can usually find in yogurt, to one of 2 groups of mice. The probiotic mice were much more likely to persevere and succeed in the face of adversity tests than those not treated with the probiotic. They repeated a similar study in humans, with the probiotic-fed humans displaying improved resilience to negative emotions than those without the probiotic. Some scientists hypothesize that the root evolutionary cause of this may be that your bacteria's ultimate goal is to spread. So when we cultivate a healthy gut population, the signals they're sending to our brain are encouraging us to be happy and social and go out in search of food so that we introduce them to more hosts. So by shaking each other's hand or kissing other people, we're picking up other people's bacteria and spreading our personal microbiomes, with all the benefits and drawbacks that entails, which is terrifying. There's all kinds of crazy ways that the bugs living inside you are connected to your brain, and it's a burgeoning research field that has great potential for personalized medicine. Imagine your doctor sampling your microbiota and knowing exactly which bacteria were sending you what signals, and then being able to modify your behavior, whether it be mood or diet related, by supplementing your gut environment with some new critters. Freaky. Want a healthy diet of science in your life? Then why not subscribe and watch this video about how antibiotic-resistant bacteria.
So we all have something called a microbiome. There's many species of bacteria or fungus, say, in our bodies, especially the gut, that are with us our whole lives, once we're born, that have lived sort of with and in and on humans for millions of years, right? Our entire evolutionary history. And that's a symbiotic relationship. We're their hosts, but they do really important things for us. So they play a role in protecting us from infections that would make us sick, right? They'll go kill other bugs that are bad for us. Right? Like their defenses of their territory against invaders protect us. And they produce vitamins like vitamin B that we need, but don't produce naturally. And as you've seen there, they can also induce us to do things like, say, eat food that they like, and they can produce neurotransmitters like serotonin that could make you feel happy or reward you for doing something. So next time you get a chocolate bar, you want to think, who are you really eating that for? So back to the nervous system. So the nervous system is the body's speedy electrochemical communication network, and it consists of all the nerve cells of the central and peripheral nervous systems. And as we've said before, the central nervous system refers to the brain and the spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system connects it to the rest of the body. And then the peripheral nervous system is divided into autonomic and somatic systems. So if I'm going to consciously move my body, that's going to go through my somatic nervous system. But then your heartbeat, you're not controlling that, goes through your autonomic nervous system. And then the autonomic nervous system is divided into the sympathetic, kind of arousing, fight the tiger system, and then the parasympathetic system, which is about relaxation, calming yourself back down. So there's different types of neurons associated with the somatic nervous system. So there are sensory neurons. So if I'm going to touch this desk, right, there's going to be some sensory receptors in my fingertips, and neurons that detect that and that carry that message up to my brain. Or if I'm touching something hot, that would trigger a reflex that doesn't need to go to the brain. But the point is, there's an incoming message system, right? And then there are motor neurons. So if I'm going to reach out and pick this up, something has to make me move, right? Something has to carry the instructions from the central nervous system out to the muscles. Then there are interneurons within the brain and spinal cord that communicate with each other and sort of send and process information between the sensory input and the motor output. Simple reflex does not involve the brain in action. So let's say that I'm going to reach out and touch something hot. There's a reflex that'll make me pull my finger away. So there'll be receptors in my skin that detect that heat, right? And the sensory neuron will bring in the incoming information. And then that goes to an interneuron in the spine. And then a motor neuron will send the outgoing information that gets me to pull my hand back. All of that happens, that action happens without involving the higher brain. Though, of course, a message will get sent to your brain. You'll be aware that that happened, but kind of after the fact. And you don't need that for the reflex itself, which happens at a much lower level. Right? And then you'll maybe feel pain as well. But that reflex happens kind of at the spinal level. So the peripheral nervous system has two parts, somatic and autonomic. And the somatic system refers to those skeletal muscles that you control voluntarily while you're holding your pencil and writing with it. You can decide to do that, okay? And you can voluntarily put your pencil down, okay? And then there's functions in your body that are under the rule of the autonomic nervous system. You cannot, say, commit suicide by telling your heart to stop beating. It just doesn't work. It's not going to happen because it's under the control of your autonomic nervous system that is self-regulated. The autonomic nervous system has those two divisions, sympathetic and parasympathetic. We'll come back to this next week in the unit on stress, but basically the sympathetic subdivision is about arousal. It's about spending energy, and it enables voluntary control of your skeletal muscles so that you can go fight lions and tigers and bears or run away from them. Okay, so it's like dilating your pupils so that you can better see the dragon. It accelerates your heartbeat so that you have oxygenated blood pumping around. Okay? It inhibits digestion because when you're fighting dragons, you don't really want to be digesting stuff. In fact, you might want to run to the bathroom when you're scared. That's a pretty common occurrence. Glucose will be released into your blood. Okay? So people who have a lot of stress can run higher blood sugar levels. And then your adrenal glands put out hormones like adrenaline, okay? And then once that's all over and you have defeated the dragon, your parasympathetic nervous system will kick in to calm you down. So your pupils will contract and your heartbeat will slow and you'll go back to digesting things. If you need all your energy focused on your skeletal muscles and dragon fighting, there isn't really the capacity or the bandwidth, if you please, to do things like, digest food. Right? That's why the energy gets away from there. But now it can come back. Now it's snack time, okay? And it allows blood flow back to the genitals because of the other things you might be interested in doing after you've done dragon fighting. But when you're dragon fighting, okay, it's all about the sympathetic nervous system. Nerves send their electrochemical messages very, very quickly, okay? It's a super fast system. But then the body has another system, which is a much slower system, okay? With messengers called hormones that are released into your bloodstream. Okay? It's the slow hormones in blood pathway. And hormones control growth, development, including brain development, okay? Moods, metabolism, function of organs, and reproductive behavior. So hormones can affect behavior profoundly. Like if you've ever had a kitten and didn't get it spayed yet, right? A really obvious example of that is like a cat in heat. If you don't get a female cat spayed at certain points of her cycle, her behavior is almost completely directed at the reproductive instinct. It is not subtle at all. And it involves a lot of different complex behaviors like lordosis, that's the butt dance, yowling, trying to get outside to meet boy cats who are now suddenly interesting, which would normally want nothing to do with. You see the really profound effect that hormones can have on behavior. So the endocrine system is refers to a set of glands that secrete these hormones into the bloodstream, and they travel through the body and affect other tissues or organs, including the brain. And the master gland that influences hormone release by the other glands is called the pituitary. And the pituitary is just under the brain. It's not part of the brain. And it's connected to the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus, which is above it, is a midbrain structure. And so it'll influence hormone release by other glands. Let's say the adrenal glands to release adrenaline, so you can fight your dragon. And then the hypothalamus regulates the pituitary in a feedback system. There are certain key endocrine glands. This is from your textbook. For instance, the thyroid affects metabolism, the testes. So, and ovaries secrete sex hormones, which have an effect on masculine and feminine behavior. Then there are the adrenal glands for the fight or flight response. Now, I'm going to go back to the brain now. I'll ask you a question. How do you know that you have a brain? Are you just going to believe me telling you that you do? Yeah? Have you ever seen your brain? Yeah? Yes. So that is one way that you might know that you have a brain, okay, to image it. But we haven't always known that the brain was important or believed that it was the seat of the self, of knowledge. The Egyptians took a lot of care when they were mummifying their kings, and they ceremonially preserved all the important bits. What do they do with the brain? Yes. They did take it out, and then did they put it in a beautiful canopic jar? No. What did they do with it? They just threw it out because they thought it was garbage. Because they knew that the seat of yourself, your thoughts, your knowledge is your heart, right? If you know something, you know it in your heart. One of the ways where we started, I knock pseudoscience a lot, but have you heard of phrenology? There was a time probably around the Victorian era where someone had the idea that we can read your personality by feeling your skull. And if there's a lump over here, it means that you're a funny person. And it was a pseudoscience. I think there's a joke in your textbook that said that Mark Twain went to a phrenologist who felt his skull and said, oh, you have a very flat area over here, and it means that you don't have a sense of humor. Didn't know it was Mark Twain, who's a famous comedian. But when he went to another phrenologist who knew he was Mark Twain, the phrenologist read him like to be a very funny person based on what he was feeling. It's a pseudoscience. There's no connection between like your lumps on your skull and your personality or your abilities. But this did lead us to thinking about whether parts of your brain that are under your skull do different things. And in fact, that is true. So I know I knock pseudoscience a lot, but often it's important in certain ways, like maybe historically, and leading us from maybe one wrong idea along the right path to something better. And so phrenology has important history in understanding the brain. So one of the first ways we understood how the brain works is through damage. So you could do autopsies and look at how brains might be different in people with certain disorders. And one disorder that profoundly affected behavior, let's say 200 years ago, was syphilis. And the brains of people who died of syphilis, who had all these strange behaviors, look quite different. Okay, so we're making a connection between brain and behavior. Anyone know this picture? It's a very famous picture in psychology. Know who this guy is? Yes? Do you know what happened to him? It's Phineas Gage.
Like a hole or something shot up like through his skull, up his eye, and then out his brain.
Yes, he was a railroad worker. It was a railroad spike. And
he survived, but he had like a lot of vision.
yeah, and it was of a particular kind. So his brain was damaged in a particular place. It damaged the frontal lobe, and it changed his personality so that he used to be an honest person, but he became somebody that cheated and stole and lied. And so that told us something about what the frontal lobes do. Can also experimentally damage parts of, let's say, an animal's brain and see what now they will not be able to do. I can tell you what that part of the brain does. Okay? So there was a lot of research on decorticating animals, so taking off the top layer of the brain. Cortex is the Latin word for bark. So they're the very topmost layers called the cortex. And then the psychologist would ask, well, what can a decorticated dog still learn? And that research taught us that the cortex is not at all needed for conditioning. Okay, so we know that you can condition really simple animals. You can condition like sea slugs. Actually, this is kind of an aside because I know we had that thing on caterpillars, But a caterpillar can be classically conditioned to avoid a smell by pairing the smell with a shock. And then after the caterpillar goes through metamorphosis, where it kind of everything turns into soup and is reorganized, it still knows that the butterfly will avoid that scent, the moth will avoid that scent. It's pretty cool, isn't it? Sorry, I got that. That was a total aside and will not be on the test. But so what that taught us is that the cortex isn't needed for conditioning, right? It's a primal form of learning, and it's mediated by subcortical lower brain structures. We could ask, well, what could decorticated cats, like a poor cat there, do? Right? They can still run, they can still climb, groom, and show emotional responses, but there's like a kind of, I don't know if reflexive is the right word for it. It's not purposeful behavior. Okay, so they're almost in like a state of stupor between being provoked to do those things. Okay, and that told us that we need the cortex for adaptive problem-solving responses and purposeful behavior. Okay. One way is to stimulate a certain brain region and then see what happens. So if a scientist touches, or let's say electronically activates a certain part of the somatosensory cortex, that's part of the cortex where you feel something, then the person will feel, let's say, something touching their hand, depending on what the location it was touched was, but nothing touched their hand. It's happening in the brain. And then if a part of the motor cortex is stimulated, and it depends on which part is stimulated, a person would feel an urge to move part of their body or believe that they moved it. And that's how we figured out that actually moving something is a different part of the brain from the part that perceives that you moved or intended you to move. So by placing electrodes in different parts of the brain, Jose Delgado would get animals to smile, snarl, feel bliss, feel terror, hunger, lust, and other sensations. We'll talk about some of the ways that we measure brain activity. The oldest one is the EEG. You ever had that? Of like a cap on your head, there's some gel. And what that does is record the electrical signals that are generated by the activity of thousands of neurons under each electrode. And that reads as waves or brain waves. And so we know that these waves look different when people are in different states of arousal, right? Awake versus relaxed, and then in different stages of sleep. Instead of measuring neurons' electrical signals, MEG, magnetoencephalography, uses detectors around the head to measure the magnetic field that is generated by electrical activity. And it does a better job of EEG in pinpointing an exact location of activity. And it can identify clusters of neurons in specific regions of the brain. A CT scanner, anyone been in something like ever had a CT scan before? Yeah? Did it feel like claustrophobic in there?
No, it wasn't too bad.
Okay. Did you get to see your brain?
No.
So what that does is take a series of X-ray photographs from different angles in the same plane. So it shows you a slice of the brain. And it gives you a sort of very 2D view of brain structure. And if you wanted to know the structure of the whole brain, you'd have to take 1,000 slices and then piece that together. Then we could ask about function, about where something is happening. Think about a heat map that shows you which parts of your body are hot. A PET scan also gives you a low resolution slice view, but it shows you where activity is happening, okay, where functioning is happening. So it's not a picture of structure, but you can get a sense of structure from it. It's not a heat map, it's a glucose burning map, because when your brain is active, it's burning glucose, and it tells you which parts are more actively consuming glucose. So researchers would inject a person with a radioactive form of glucose in order to be able to image that. Okay, I'll show you what's a high glucose flow area and what's a low glucose flow area. And over here, it's kind of showing that when you're looking at something, there's more activation at the back of the brain. That's where the occipital lobe is, that's involved in seeing, right? And you can see over here, oops, the activation for listening is in the auditory lobes. If you want a really detailed view of brain structure, you get that from MRI, from magnetic resonance imaging. And I'm thinking that I probably don't need to go through this, but most of your body is made up of water molecules. That's made of hydrogen and oxygen atoms. And there's a proton at the center of each hydrogen atom, and it's like a tiny magnet. It's very sensitive to magnetic fields. And if you're in that tube, there are powerful scanner magnets that will sort of pull all of these protons to align in the same direction. And then they use a burst of radio waves to knock the protons out of alignment. And as soon as the radio waves are turned off, the protons realign. And that sends out radio signals. And that is where you get the information used to build that picture. And it is an incredibly high resolution image because protons are really, really small. You can differentiate between different kinds of tissues, okay? Because the protons in different types of tissue realign at different speeds and they give distinct signals. Right? You can see where that guy has teeth and bone and different parts of the brain. So you get a picture. And one of these MRI scans is of a healthy individual, and one of them has schizophrenia. Any idea which is which? There are positive and negative symptoms in schizophrenia. The positive symptoms are things like, oh, I hear a voice, I see something's not there, it's kind of active. And then there are negative symptoms that sometimes come with progression of the disease where people kind of seem apathetic, and that's associated with these ventricles getting bigger. You can see that on that image, right? MRI can also detect the blood concentration of oxygen. Oxygen is another kind of fuel that neurons use. And if you perform multiple MRI scans in quick succession, it'll show changes in the flow of oxygenated blood to parts of the brain that are most active during a cognitive task. So the person that is in the scanner will be asked to do something, okay? And we use that to shade certain areas, say blue to say that there was a lower rate of flow in the brain to these areas when they were doing that task. This is a jazz pianist improvising, but you can see that certain parts of the jazz pianist brain had higher oxygen utilization, and it's showing us that those parts of the brain are most active. And this is sort of a simplified image from your textbook, but here it's showing that when somebody is engaging in conversation, there's a higher level of oxygen flow to what we know are the language areas of the brain. That's like Broca's area and Wernicke's area. Have you ever seen a brain? Like held a brain? I see one, yes. 2, 3. Anyone ever eaten a brain? Hopefully not a human brain. They're very high cholesterol. What was the brain like?
Brain, yeah. Many different folds, but.
And was it raw or was it preserved?
Those preserved.
Mine was preserved as well. It was like a little bit like hard almost.
Yes.
Like, yeah.
Yeah, so that hardness reflects the action of the formaldehyde that it's preserved with, and that congeals the protein so that it's like a hard-boiled egg. So if you want to know what an unpreserved brain is, think more like, well, like what's a raw egg like? Okay. Brains are heavy. They weigh about 3 pounds, or about 2% of your body weight, and they're squishy. So the texture is like Jell-O or soft tofu or cottage cheese. Zombie wouldn't eat a brain, kind of like a hard-boiled egg. An apple, more of a, it's very soft. and very, very delicate. Like without the preservation and the chemical hardening, you probably couldn't really pick it up, okay? You certainly couldn't like slice into it and look at the different structures. It needs to be hardened for that. So your brain is very, very delicate, and that's why you have to take care of it. Its protection comes from your skull. That's why helmets are a good idea. But right off the bat there, you can see that there's two sides to the brain that are separated by a deep fissure. Those sides are called hemispheres. So you have a left hemisphere and a right hemisphere, and the nerves going to each side cross over in your neck. So the left hemisphere, right side of your body, and your right hemisphere controls the left side of your body. So if you had a stroke on one side of your brain, you might end up with paralysis on the opposite side of the body from that hemisphere. If you start with the deepest and the oldest part of the brain, because that's kind of how the way the brain developed. Our evolutionary oldest parts are the deepest ones, and then as we evolve, we got layers. And our most, our complex higher order thinking would probably involve our cortex, the outermost part of the brain. The brainstem, okay, is an extension of the spinal cord. So the spinal cord becomes the brainstem. And the medulla is located at the brainstem, at the base of the brainstem, and it controls your heartbeat and breathing. Above that is the pons, which helps coordinate movement. And on top of that is the thalamus, which sends sensory messages up to the higher brain regions and transmits replies to the lower regions. So it's like a switchboard. And then running up through that is the reticular formation. It's a nerve network that runs through the brainstem and thalamus and has a key role in controlling arousal. We know that because there were studies with, let's say, cats where they would cut that, and then the animal is in a coma that it cannot be woken from. The cerebellum looks like a little brain at the bottom of the brain, okay? And it has a number of functions, but one of them that's key is muscular control and coordination of movement. Damage to the cerebellum is associated with a disability called cerebral palsy. There's difficulty with movement. But now what does a really highly developed cerebellum look like? Well, you'll get cat brain. It has a much larger cerebellum relative to the rest of the brain than humans do. And that's connected to cats' very impressive stalking and fence walking superpowers. You can't do that. Very normal for a cat to do that. Then there's the limbic system in your midbrain. And that's associated with, say, emotion in the amygdala. It's also associated with learning and with memory. Okay, so the key structures are the hippocampus. That means seahorse because it's kind of seahorse shaped. And that's I tried to relate it to a book truck, a library truck assistant that is consolidating, putting away memories. It helps process your conscious memories. The amygdala, that means almond. So it's almond shaped. It's involved in the emotional responses like aggression and fear. So you could stimulate an animal's amygdala and then have it go just spontaneously attack. There's the hypothalamus, which we've already mentioned, that's involved in various maintenance functions, and the reward system, and in controlling of the endocrine system. The hypothalamus controls the pituitary by stimulating it to get to release hormones, which would then get other glands in the endocrine system to release their hormones. The largest part of your brain is called the cerebrum. Okay, it's newer in evolutionary terms. Okay, and its oldest structures are the deepest. But on the outside, okay, is the cerebral cortex. And cortex means bark. And there's various subcortical structures. And it's divided into 4 lobes. So there's the frontal lobe, and that's involved in judgment and in movement, and that was what was damaged famously in Phineas Gage. And there's the parietal lobe that's involved in sensation. There's a motor and a sensory part of the brain, and the motor part is at the very back of the frontal lobe, and then the sensory part is at the very front of the parietal lobe. So it's involved in sensation. And then there's the temporal lobes on the side that process auditory information from your ears, and the occipital lobe at the back that processes visual information. If you open somebody's skull, and please don't do that, the first thing you'd see is the cerebral cortex. You can imagine like how difficult and complicated neurosurgery is when the texture that they're working is something like cottage cheese. Imagine how much skill that involves. Expect that a lot. So the cerebral cortex covers the outer layer of both hemispheres, and the cortex itself has layers. There's 6 layers with different kinds of cells. Going back to those lobes, so the frontal lobes are involved in the executive functions, planning, judgment, including moral judgment. It's involved in the production of speech and the movement of the body. The frontal lobes are still developing in teenagers, which is one reason why they do more risky things. And at the back of the frontal lobe, right, just where it meets the parietal lobe, you have the motor cortex, which is about the initiation of voluntary movement, the intention to move, and the perception that you have moved. But as we know, lower brain areas, that would include the cerebellum and the pons, coordinate the muscles that actually perform the movement. Okay. Then the parietal lobe processes information from the senses, and the topmost part of it there is the somatosensory cortex. And it sends that information to other parts of your brain to be interpreted. And it plays a role in your ability to navigate and control your body, to understand spatial orientation and direction. It has a role in your ability to judge shape, size, distance, and interpret symbols. And the somatosensory cortex up there processes sensation from your skin, like touch, vibration, temperature, pain, and from the inside of your body, including things like the position of your head, right, or the feeling of the body moving, like pain and internal organs. The cortices that process the sensations of taste and smell are deep down in what's called the sylvian fissure, which separates the parietal from the frontal and the temporal lobes. As you can see from this very famous but inexact representation, the amount of cortex that's devoted to a body part in either the motor cortex or in the somatosensory cortex is not proportional to that body part size. So maybe your arm is big, there's a lot of area there, but it gets a lot less representation than your fingertips, which cover a very small amount of area in terms of skin, but pick up a lot more information that needs to be processed. And so somebody came up with these, the sensory homunculus and the motor homunculus, and they were they represent what a body would look like if the size of the body, where body parts are represented by how much somatosensory cortex or motor cortex would be devoted to them. So there's a sensory homunculus and a motor homunculus. Are there any differences that you notice between the two? There's similarities. Both show you that, wow, hands and fingers and lips and tongue and eyes get a lot of processing power, a lot of space in those cortices. Do you notice any differences? I heard giggling. I thought that was probably onto it. Yes?
The sensory one has the ears.
Very good point. And why would there be no representation of ears on the motor homunculus? Exactly. Some people can wiggle their ears. But that gets at it exactly. So it's very polite of you guys not to notice, but the sensory homunculus is well endowed, and the motor homunculus is like a Barbie doll for a similar reason. So It is a male being, and the erection is a simple reflex that goes through the spinal cord, and that doesn't need the involvement of the motor cortex. But the feelings are being registered. Onto the temporal lobes. So those contain the auditory cortices, which process information from your ears. And now you've got lateralization. There's some lateralization in the brain, so the left and the right sides don't do quite the same thing. So the right auditory cortex is more sensitive to tonality, right, to tone, and where the left auditory cortex is more sensitive to sequential differences in sound. Okay, so I'm saying that not because I want you to remember that, but just to understand that there's some lateralization of function between the left and the right sides. Then your occipital lobe contains the primary visual cortex that processes information from your eyes. And just like with your body, there's that crossover thing going on. So there's different sides to your visual field. You have a left visual field, which is like say most of your left eye, and a right visual field. But then there's a crossover of the, it's called the occipital, I can't remember the name of the nerve, the one that comes out your eyes, okay, that gets crossed over. And so information from the left visual field goes to right visual cortex, and information from your right visual field goes to the left visual cortex. And it's the optic nerve. I don't know how I forgot that. Okay, and there are specialized language areas in the brain and the cortex. And these are in your textbook, but Broca's area is involved in producing language. Somebody who has a stroke affecting that area might not be able to speak, but they will understand what you're saying. Then Wernicke's area has a role in understanding language. And if somebody has a stroke that affects that, they can understand what you're saying, but if they tried to speak back to you, it'd just be garbled and gibberish. Strangely, singing is processed somewhere else. So somebody who can't speak because they've had a stroke like that will be able to sing. Brains are pretty interesting. And then the angular gyrus is involved in converting images, say like written words, or let's say looking at people's lips when they're speaking, into an auditory code that is then interpreted by Wernicke's area. Much of the cortex consists of association areas that are about connecting and interpreting information from many parts of the brain. That's where you interpret events, make judgments, and plan. So if somebody had damage to the association areas, let's say they might have excellent cake baking skills, and they might agree to bake a cake, but then forget the recipe, but feel bad for not making it. So it's that really high level kind of coordination. Neurons with similar functions will group together to form networks, and those are like hotspots. And for example, there's a hotspot for identifying faces. We see faces really readily, like in bark, in clouds, on grilled cheese sandwiches. And so there's something called I think it's the Fusiform Gyrus that does that. That sort of helps you see faces and things. This is a front view of the brain, and it shows you how you have those two hemispheres, left and right. And there's something that bridges those two hemispheres so that they can communicate with each other. Does anyone know what that is? So at one point in history, they used to cut it in people who had very bad seizures. I don't think they do that anymore. They're joined together by the corpus callosum, which is like a highway, right, of neural tracts that connect those two sides of the brain. So that large band of fibers, of neural fibers, is called the corpus callosum. And in the past, it has been severed just to stop severe seizures. And that creates something called a split brain. And there's a lot of psychological research on split brain patients. And something they describe is that maybe somebody, that the person seems to have two minds, that generally it works out well, but the person might be buttoning up their shirt with one hand and then unbuttoning it with the other. You can get along pretty well with half a brain. So in cases with really severe seizures in the past, have to take out one hemisphere. And when that's happened with children, the patients have gone on to do very well. I think it's Christina Santhouse there. She has a master's degree. She's a speech pathologist. She's married with kids. There's no deficit. And that reflects something called neuroplasticity. So at first, maybe she had paralysis on the other side of the body, but then she kind of learned, right? She formed new connections. And so that goes well in, let's say, children, but while somebody can survive a gunshot going through the head, not too deeply, of course, it goes through one hemisphere, people who have that kind of damage can, well, you don't want to do this, don't try it at home. They can sometimes get along fairly well because of neuroplasticity. So people can survive major brain injuries to one hemisphere. However, some things don't regenerate. If you sever your spinal cord, it doesn't grow back. Looking forward to the future, it's something called brain-computer interfacing, and it provides hope to people with brain or spinal cord injuries. So imagine if you could somehow program a computer, some device, to pick up an electrical signal from the motor cortex of someone with paraplegia because they had a severed spinal cord, and then somehow rewrite it past, right, so that they're able to move. So there's research on that. And then maybe in the future, we'll be able to somehow pick up people's brain waves and get them to control devices so you don't have to use your fingers.
With your mind. It's being developed by Control Labs, a Manhattan-based startup that's backed by tech giants Amazon and Alphabet.
Control Labs develops neural interfaces to make our interactions with technology more fluid, to the point where devices feel like they become part of you.
Patrick Kafosh founded Control Labs with Thomas Reardon. Both of them have PhDs in neuroscience from Columbia University, and Reardon also created Internet Explorer while he was at Microsoft. To make this human-machine link possible, Kafosh and Reardon figured out how to tap into the body's nervous system.
Your brain actually generates commands that then propagate out to your muscles to allow you to move in the world. That's all relayed via what's called the motor nervous system. Ultimately, your brain sends down a signal down to your spinal cord, and your spinal cord in turn relays that out to the muscles. This is an electrical signal that actually is received at the muscle.
An armband outfitted with a number of sensors detects this electrical activity and sends it to a computer. From there, algorithms decode it and use the signals to manipulate a machine. Users can then do things like scroll through text, turn a dial, or select items from a menu. The signals can even be used to control robots.
You don't actually have to move for us to decode some of your intentions. What you have to do is generate that electrical pulse. So what you notice is my hand looks like it's in a fist right now, but if she just keeps me from opening my hand, I can actually open my hand all the way. Or we can turn it here, and you'll notice I can like do one finger or two fingers, or my whole hand. I do that by just generating the nerve impulse, even though I'm not moving. We don't decode your movement, we decode your intention.
I got to give the system a go to see if it really works. First, I had to calibrate the sensors to my neural signals. It wasn't perfect, but the system was able to detect less intricate motions, such as picking up a water bottle or practicing a Queen's wave. Next, I got to really put the system to the test. My task, to hit a number of moving targets by just thinking about where I wanted the cursor to go and trying to not move my hand.
You basically want to retrain yourself to think about how you're going to generate force without really moving. Because you don't have to, but you're used to doing that.
As the demo progressed, the system got better at reading my neural signals, and I got faster at hitting the targets.
People approach us all the time and ask us, what's the first use case for this technology? It's as if I came to you at the end of the 19th century and said, hey, look, we have this new thing called electricity, and we can generate it on the fly. And you're the VC, and you ask me, like, so what are you going to use this electricity for? And I'm like, what are we not going to use it for? Your phone, a tablet, the computer that's built into a kiosk at the airport. All of those things are potential areas in which Control Labs can completely change the means by which we interact with those experiences.
The team thinks the technology will initially be used for augmented reality and VR. But Control Labs is also experimenting with medical applications.
The first group to which we gave a device was at Johns Hopkins University, where they're using this for neurorehabilitation around stroke and hand transplants.
Later this year, Control Labs will release its technology to software developers.
I have every,
If you are interested in that kind of thing, or neuroscience, cognitive neuroscience, then you might be interested in taking transfer credits from Dalhousie, where there's a department of psychology and neuroscience. And here at St. Mary's, we have Jason Ivanov, who's a cognitive neuroscientist, and he teaches the biological psychology class, which I believe is taught right after this one. And yes, you can look him up and ask him questions if you're interested. Now, if you have any questions, let me know. I have put some optional resources on Brightspace. So there's a 3D brain that you can explore, 2-minute neuroscience videos. I'm not asking you to go look at them if you're interested, or if there's something that you don't understand from your textbook, you might find something there. So for the next class, we have 3 modules, 17 to 19, on sensation and perception. We'll end 5 minutes early. Thank you very much.